All right, everybody. Welcome back to our notes here. And this is part two of imperialism in Africa. So I hope everyone did all right with the first day, and maybe it's your second day. I don't know when you're going to look at this, but I was doing okay with this week's adjustment with learning. Please give me any feedback that you have. Again, I want to make it as painless, but also as informative as possible without going too far overboard. So today we have two big questions we're going to look at. Number one, the last one we talked about how disease, strong African nations, and just the geography of Africa itself kept European powers out. So how then within like a short time frame, really the 1880s until the early 1900s, so we're talking 20 to 30 years, all of a sudden Europe really gobbles up all of Africa. They get almost every single piece of it. How did that happen? Considering for hundreds of years, thousands of years, Europe could not really get into the heart of Africa. So how does that happen? How did they overcome the terrain, disease, and strong nations? So that's what that's gonna be the primary focus of today. We're also going to look at kind of a case study of once the Europeans did take over, what horrible things happened to Africa. And then we're also going to take a look at the one area that wasn't taken over in Africa by the Europeans, and that was Ethiopia. So here we go. All right, so the first thing that's happened that's really famous is called the Berlin Conference. Does anyone want to guess what city the Berlin Conference was held in? Good. Berlin. I'm assuming you got that one. So Berlin, Germany, and the conference was basically they were deciding on how to divide up Africa. Literally, they made it like almost like pizza. When I was in college, we'd all gather around and we'd say, "Okay, I get this corner, you get that corner." We'd divide it up. And sadly, that's what they did to Africa. The European powers kind of sat around a table in Berlin and they divided up Africa. So there were 14 European nations that were actually there. And shocking, probably to none of you, there were no African nations that were there. So it was literally the Europeans deciding Africa's fate without any African input. And as you can imagine, that is not going to go well. And the Europeans said, okay, we don't want to fight one another. So all you have to do when you take over some territory is occupy it and then notify other European powers, and then you can have it. So imagine if I said, hey kids, in the courtyard, say when we see each other again, I said there are 100 treasure chests buried underneath the courtyard, and you can in the treasure chests there are $1 million in one of them. There are keys to a new car in another. There's free college tuition. There's and then there's smaller things, maybe gift cards. Those earworm things you guys put in your ears and wear around all day. Those things are there. Things that you really care about. And I said, okay, when I say go, you can go try to occupy. All you have to do is occupy the land and say that it's yours, plant a flag there, and that spot's yours, and you get to dig in it. And you can plant as many flags as you can get, but you can't rip out anyone else's flag. And I said, go. You would all sprint out of the room super fast, and sprint around as quickly as you could. It'd be a scramble to get out of the room. And that's what this is called, is the scramble for Africa, because that's what the European powers literally did. There it is, scramble for Africa. Now, this makes me really sad. There's an activity, it says right here, which is one of my favorite activities of the year. And I don't know how much time we're going to have together. Hopefully we get back. But we are doing this activity. I don't care if it doesn't make sense. It's a lot of fun, and it's a lot of kids' one of their favorite things of the year. So we'll try to do that. But we actually do a recreation of the Scramble for Africa. So continuing. So how did they just start scrambling and taking over this land if they hadn't been able to before? Well, number one, how did they overcome the environment? Well, I hope you remember from our last lesson the justification why Europe why they wanted to go to some of these places is they wanted free labor or cheap labor. They wanted a market for their goods, and all that was driven by the Industrial Revolution. Well, guess what's going to be one of the things that gives the Europeans the advantage here? the Industrial Revolution. So I want you to think, what during the Industrial Revolution might help Europeans to go through the continent of Africa where they hadn't been able to do so before, where they could get over it quicker, safer, they could get around it a little bit better. I hope you guessed it, steam engines. So we have the steamboats and steam engines, steam trains. That's going to help a lot. We talk about how the mosquitoes and animals of Africa could be dangerous. Well, if you're on a train or in the middle of a boat in the water, it's a lot safer. And steamboats could go up the river and then they could go back. Before that, you couldn't really do that. You had to go downriver and then you had to portage out. You had to walk out. So it just made it a lot easier for travel and provide troops or whatever else you need to travel around Africa. Continuing. Oh, Cecil Rhodes. You remember the Rhodes Scholarship I was talking about? He's the one who was like, I contend that we Britons are the greatest race in the world. Do you remember that guy? Well, this is a picture of him. He wanted to build a railroad from Cape Town to Cairo. So Cape Town is in South Africa to Cairo. That was his goal. There's a really cool movie from the 1980s. I think I mentioned it before. It's called Ghost in the Darkness. And I put a link to it somewhere on that page. And it was all about that. I really recommend you look at that link because it really kind of shows the justification of the Europeans and kind of their mentality and what they thought they were doing. In the movie clip, it says, Cecil Rhodes says, we're here to save the Africans from the Africans. And that was that whole social Darwinism and all that garbage that people sadly thought at that time about races. So, he wanted to do this. And there's the movie, The Ghost in the Darkness, is based on a true story where they were trying to build a railroad down here in the southern part of Africa. And their work was halted as there was actually some lions eating people. I don't remember exactly how many. I know it was over 100. Some people were actually eaten. All right, continuing. I put disease, but disease. Remember, malaria was just killing so many people, and we mentioned how it still is a very deadly disease to this day. Well, one thing that there was some doctors that were able to get some medicine out of tree bark called the quinine tree, and actually the indigenous people of South America had already known how to do this, and the Europeans noticed they weren't getting sick from malaria, and then they were able, from my understanding of the story, although I need to do some more research on it, they were able to deduce how to do this, and they were able to get this medicine, which didn't cure malaria, didn't really stop it, but it reduced the negative effects of malaria. And I put some links about malaria that are, you don't have to look at, but they're in the yellow on our week's page as well that I think you might find interesting. And we talked, so this is a cinchona tree right here, a cinchona tree. And we talked about, I wish I could really manipulate this, but these are nets to protect people. I don't know if you're familiar with Steph Curry, but I don't know if he's not, I don't think he's still doing it. Maybe he is, but 1 year in the NBA, and there's actually a newsella about this you might want to read. Every time he hit a 3-pointer, he donated so much money to give to buy nets in Africa to help stop malaria. So just kind of interesting there. All right, strong nations. If you remember when we last talked, Morocco totally just destroyed Portugal when they tried to attack. I mean, the king of Portugal disappeared. The army got taken or killed. How were the Europeans able to get into Africa? Because the Africans were strong. They had many strong nations. I named a lot of them the last lesson. And it was one of those things where, I meant to start my clock to see how long this was going, but I forgot. So, I'll just start it now. But anyhow, getting back to that, there were tons of strong African nations of millions of people. They had guns, etc. So how are the Europeans going to overcome this? Well, the Europeans, if you remember, had gone through the Industrial Revolution, particularly the Great Britain, and what they were able to do is they were able to make better weapons, really, to be honest. They were able to kind of mass produce weapons. And there was actually an American who helped design, I don't know, have you ever heard of the Gatling gun, where you turn like a hand crank to shoot out bullets, and canvas belt was fed into it? I started using that in the Civil War. Well, now things were getting even more improved. You had this Maxim machine gun, and it was the first fully automatic machine gun. So instead of having to feed the hand crank turned it to make it to work and eject the shells. Now this, you just pulled the trigger and it was automatic. So it was firing 500 rounds a minute. And a really famous poem was, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not." And so this thing here was super powerful. It was fairly lightweight. I think it was around 50 pounds. And it could do a ton of damage, as we're going to see, because I'm going to show you, not tell you, about this. I'll show you an example. Hey, here's the example. What do you know? All right, the Battle of Omdurman, 1898. This was not a good battle for the Africans. What you had, and this is the battleground, you had a number of Sudanese who actually had the high ground, which is a good thing in war. It's better to have the high ground. It's hard to go uphill when you're trying to fight versus shooting down at people. So they had an advantage there. And the British also made this is another thing you don't want to have that the British were doing. Their back was up against the river here. And if you were to get overrun, there's nowhere to really go. But the British had steamboats and they had some Maxim machine guns. And here's a picture of the battle. I don't know if you can actually see it. These are the British, and these are the Sudanese who actually come running down the hill at the British. So it was 36,000 Sudanese versus 8,000 British, but then the British had some other African allies, and they would use their other African allies to fight other African nations, and that also helped the Europeans. But they had 44 cannons, but they had 20 Maxim machine guns and 10 armored steamboats. And an eyewitness that saw the battle unfold, he said it wasn't so much a battle as a massacre, because it really wasn't much of a battle, because in this battle, the British, and normally I'd unveil it so it'd be a lot more mysterious and exciting. I'd start off here and I'd show you 0, 0, 0, and I'd say, how many Sudanese do you think died? And then it gets up to 11,000, and then I'd start over here and I'd show 8, 2, 0, so you would think there'd be more, but in reality, there are only 28 British soldiers on the British side who died to 11,000. That's insane. That would be like me saying, hey, freshman class, come try to take me down, and me taking out the entire freshman class. I mean, that's how many people it was the ratio. If you divide that up, 1 per, I don't know. This is where I need some of you math whizzes. Take 28 to 11,000. Like the kill ratio was ridiculous. I mean, you don't see this typically in warfare, and supposedly all these poor Sudanese were just cut down. Didn't even get down very far. Most of the British were killed. Actually, they didn't even need to be when a British cavalry officer rode out to try to go kill some of the Sudanese he thought was retreating, and then they got jumped, the cavalry, and they lost some more soldiers. So really, this could have been even less. So this Battle of Omdurman, it was like, oh man, I mean, Omdurman, it was just really brutal and really reflects the power of that Maxim machine gun. All right, so there was only one place, and I mentioned it. See if you remember. I know things are kind of fast and furious here, but there was only one place that was able to fight off the Europeans. ... Do you remember who it was? Ethiopia. The only one. They actually fought and defeated a European power. And this actually plays a huge role later on in history, right before World War II, because the European power that Ethiopia beat and embarrassed, they will want revenge on Ethiopia, and they actually attack before World War II, Ethiopia. So you might know it from that. But let's take a look. Well, the Battle of Adwa. This is actually, I love paintings, and this is actually a picture of that battle. And I want you to try to look and see what you can identify. And if you're in class and I called you up to the board to say, hey, what do you see in this picture that's interesting? Because art can tell us about history, right? It can either tell us about the time period that it was created, like the techniques and things, and during the time of the Renaissance with humanism, a focus more on the human portrait and things like that, or it can actually just tell you about the time period that they're painting about, and that's kind of what this does because it talks about the Battle of Adwa. So, what do you see here? Well, let me point out a few things that kids normally point out. First thing they point out is they see machine guns, and if you'll notice, both sides have machine guns, okay? And then they'll say, okay, on this side, it looks like it's Italy, which it is. But notice in the front row, these are Africans fighting for the Italians that did not like the Sudanese. So those are the Egyptians. And then over here, this is the flag of Ethiopia. They look like they had high ground, and they did at times. But if you notice, the Ethiopian leaders are out in front, many of them, kind of showing their valor. Look at the Italian officer over here. His horse is going this direction, and he's looking over his shoulder as if he's retreating. What's the deal with this flying horse? Well, that actually should give you a clue as to the religion of the Ethiopians. Typically, when you see a halo, I could start singing Beyonce right now, if you know that song. Halo, halo, halo? No? Okay. So anyhow, the halo like that, a lot of times that reflects Christianity. And you might say, what? Christianity? Ethiopia was actually one of the first Christian nations in the world. They had adopted Christianity. If you've ever seen, and this is really cool if you ever get a chance to see it, they have just carved into the ground these churches that are connected with little paths, and they're really like cut down into the ground. They're really famous. And if you've ever seen Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Ethiopia claims to have the Ark of the Covenant, which in Christian faith is where they believe the Ten Commandments are housed. So they are definitely have a Christianity in much of Ethiopia, although there is some Islam as well. So this figure here is the Archangel Gabriel. That's who it's supposed to be from Christianity, helping defeat the Italians and throwing spears into these poor guys' heads, it looks like. So anyhow, that just shows you, kind of what do you think out of this might help the Ethiopians win? Well, obviously, them having machine guns would be very important because that was one of the advantages the Europeans had gotten from the Industrial Revolution. So how did these Ethiopians get this? Well, their king, Menelik II, super duper famous because he modernized his country. He purchased weapons with the money he made, more modern weapons. And so that definitely helped things out too. And so he was, really super famous in African history as defeating the Europeans. I wish I could go into more detail about all this, but sadly we just don't have time. But Ethiopia gets independence. Italy is going to hold a grudge for this for years and years and years. Imagine if you were on a team and all your friends were on other teams, and all your friends just destroyed the people they were playing against, and then you lost. You would never hear the end of it. And so the Europeans were like, "Oh, nice job, Italy. It looks like you're not very good. You couldn't even beat Ethiopia. What's wrong with you?" So Italy kind of has a chip on its shoulder for many years, and right before World War II, Mussolini is going to attack Ethiopia. Italy is, and they're actually going to take Ethiopia back over, or they're going to take it over to try to get revenge. And they do take it over. But of course, Italy in World War II is friends with the Germans, and ultimately Italy loses and Mussolini gets killed. But that's for another day. But thing that's kind of interesting about Ethiopia is it becomes a rallying point for other African nations who had been taken by Europe. It showed that Europe could be defeated, and it gave Africans a lot of hope. You can't see this, but down here are the flags of all the different countries in Africa. there are a ton of African flags that have the same colors as Ethiopia, which are yellow, red, and green. Some of your map activities probably have that color. Um, this is just talking about the significance of Italy losing to Ethiopia in 1896 and how Ethiopia then became very important in the eyes of Africa and became kind of the symbol of African valor and resistance. And Africans, many of the Africans who were kind of in shock of the Europeans taking them over, began to break down those views of them being inferior because they're like, yeah, but Ethiopia won, and so can we. So big, important story for African kind of nationalism and belief in African pride, really. Okay, moving along here. So, what's the legacy of Europe's imperialism in Africa? Like, what happened? What legacy does it have? How should it be remembered? What types of things happened, etc.? Well, first of all, Europe ended up taking over all of Africa. Guess who got to draw the borders of Africa? This should remind you of the Middle East and what happened. Europe drew the boundaries. Excuse me. Europe drew the boundaries, and that would really disrupt African politics big time. Essentially, when they took over land and they were scrambling, they weren't paying attention to what African nations were where, and so they just took whatever they could. So when they took over land, it would be like someone taking part of Hilliard and part of Dublin, European nation, and saying, "Oh, we're going to call this Ghana." Well, you don't want to put, Hilliard and Dublin together. They're rivals in sports. It'd be much more natural to say, "Hey, put all of Kaufman." Sorry, put all of Kaufman together. But they didn't think about that. The Europeans just wherever they got, because remember it was occupy and notify, wherever they scrambled, that's what they took. So they put enemies together and they divided up friends. That's going to be problematic today in Africa, still to this day, because there are people together in different parts of Africa that were traditional enemies for hundreds of years, who then were put together, and the Europeans said, "Hey, have a democracy now." Because that's the best for a government type of government, is what the Europeans would say. And then they'd try to have votes and things, and these different ethnic groups would just disagree and have all kinds of problems. So it happened a lot. And when we play that game, hopefully you get the chance, we're going to see how that works. And these are just some examples over history of some of the areas where they've had a lot of problems with this. Some of them aren't as bad today. Some of them fought wars. Some of them fought. Sudan's a prime example. It's not on there. In Sudan, like northern Sudan, was much different from the people living in southern Sudan. And at the time, it was all together, this giant area that the British took over. And they tried to have them live together. They had a 20-plus year civil war, 20-plus years. And it was all because of a big chunk of it. I don't want to say all of it, but in large part due to how the borders were drawn. Continuing, they destroyed economic systems because kind of like what they did to the Central and South Americans. When they took over these areas in Africa, they said, "Hey, I know you were a doctor for your town here, but guess what? Now you're going to go farm this. Now you're going to go get this. You're going to work in the gold mines. You're going to You're going to get diamonds. You're going to get rubber." And so they basically destroyed the economic systems that were within Africa, and they just didn't have that economic diversity when they gained their independence. Kind of like Central and South America, they just kind of lost a lot of the things that they had traditionally done. This also causes a lot of famine. And we're going to look at a specific example in a minute called the Belgian Congo. Okay, and then just loss of traditional culture, loss of freedom, loss of identity. This is a picture from Africa where it's a German, I believe it's German teacher trying to obviously educate students, which is a great thing. But one of the things you don't see any African pictures up here. They're having them focus on the Kaiser of Germany and learn German, and basically a lot of times these schools would say, "Hey, what you used to be is not good. You were barbaric. You were this. You need to be more civilized, like Germany. When in reality, what these European countries were doing was the uncivilized thing, and a lot of these different African nations had tons of civilization. So it's just kind of an unfortunate thing that happened there, and it's something that's happened in our own country with the United States. Here we see Native Americans in the United States in the late 1800s that some of the some of the U.S. government officials probably had good intentions. They thought they were actually helping them, but in reality, they were destroying who they were as a people. And a lot of them didn't have good intentions that forced the Native Americans to change their names, cut their hair, not speak their own language. And here's just some pictures of that. That was going on in Africa as well. Here's another one. I actually have a good book about this if we get back that I can share, especially if you like football too, because it's about football. Whoa, this one, ugh, this one makes me so angry. But I have to tell you about it because it used to be part of our standards, and it still drives me insane. It's like, okay, well, what were the positives of imperialism? So I'm going to give you a second to think about that. What could be positive about what happened with imperialism? Because I'll tell you what, there was certainly a lot of negative, horrible, awful things that still cause problems today. So what might have been a positive? All right, here we go. Let's take a look. Reduce local warfare. That's an interesting one. Did they maybe stop some of the Africans from fighting one another? Sure, but that's because they had totally oppressed them and worked them and put them in more horrible working conditions, or helped one side over the other so much the other side got destroyed. I mean, I think that, to me, that's just, I'm not a big fan of that one. Improved sanitation. Probably in some areas of Africa, the sanitation improved, but in some areas of the African nations, they already had plumbing. They already had pipes and things like that for indoor plumbing. So I think it just depended where you were in Africa. Increased lifespans. Do you remember seeing the lifespans in the CIA.gov and how horrible they were? Now, granted, I'm sure they went up, but all the world was going up at this time because of the Industrial Revolution, and I think Africa's would have naturally gone up on their own, but some people would say that. Higher literacy rates, that's probably true in terms of some of the education, and but they were also forced to not use their language at times. So think about that. Railroads, they definitely had railroads, but don't you think that Africa would have eventually gotten railroads on their own just through the powers of globalization and trade and things like that? Same with dams and telephones. It did strengthen African nationalism. It made many areas in Africa much more prideful of their region, and so I guess it did that. And certainly higher quality goods were available because of the Industrial Revolution and those machine-made goods. So those are some things. So if you ever have to answer a question about the positives, I mean, for me, I'd have a hard time doing it. But if you had to pick one, I mean, maybe, I don't know, out of those, higher literacy rates, I don't know. That's for you to figure out. All right, so you should probably take a quick break. We've probably been going for about 25 minutes. So you might want to pause this, take a break, because now I'm going to give you a specific example that's kind of sad. So that's why it's called Scars of Imperialism, that we can still see to this day from the damage that was done. All right, so you can pause, but I'm going to continue. So we're going to look at the Belgian Congo. There's a really famous book called King Leopold's Ghost. It's really sad. I have it in my room somewhere if you ever want to borrow it. We'll talk about those other things later there. And you read about this, some of you, if you did the Newsella article that I assigned, and make sure you do that. Take the Newsella quiz just like we normally do, and then take my mastery assessment quiz on Newsella as well, or the quick check that was 4 points. So King Leopold II was the king of Belgium. The thing about him, and there he is with his luxurious beard that he supposedly put like plastic bag or a bag around anytime he went to the ocean. He was paranoid about it. But he claimed he wanted to end slavery and spread Christianity. Hey, that sounds nice, right? But supposedly that was just a front so that he could do something else. Kind of like a kid that's like, oh, yes, I need to go get a drink of water. And then they go do something else at school. This is kind of like it was what he was doing. He's like, hey, we want to go to Africa because we want to end slavery and spread Christianity. He said he wanted to open civilization, the only part of the globe which has not yet been penetrated, to pierce the darkness which hangs over an entire peoples, is, I dare say, a crusade worthy of this century of progress. Which just that language there is very demeaning and makes me angry. But he was pretending, as many people that were imperialists thought they were helping others, and that's what he was saying he was trying to do. But in reality, that wasn't what he was doing at all. He sent in Henry Stanley, who was an American. It's a long story behind him, Stanley and Livingston. I'd love to teach you about it. We don't have time. Although I think the Jumanji guy is based off of, the Hunter is based off of him in the original. But there's some quotes there you can kind of take a look at. It's just showing again how ignorant they were, honestly. So you can take a look at that. There's no homework to go over. That's for if we had been together, I would have given you a homework assignment there, but that's okay. You don't need to do it. So yeah, he claimed he wanted to end slavery and spread Christianity. What he really wanted to spread was rubber plants because it was a cash crop. He wanted to make money. But in doing this, they estimate around 10 million people died in his quest to get rubber plants. It was awful what they did. They'd burn down villages. They'd shoot people. The food became scarce because they were having to go find cash crops. So people who had been farming and farming and farming, they're like, no, you need to go get rubber out of the trees in the forest, and if you don't, we'll throw your family in jail. We'll hurt your family. We'll hurt you. And so all these farmers and other people had to go get cash crops. Here's an example of a village. This actually comes from the book, Leopold's Ghost. This was a village in the Democratic Republic of Congo region. You look, there it is. They got some roads there and some nice homes, and you can see it's very forest, a lot of forest around it because it was near the equator. But now let me show you after the Belgians got through with it. This is what it looked like. And you might say, well, why would they tear down all the homes? Why would they burn down all the homes? Because they definitely had a reason. The reason they did it is this is an example. Let's pretend this is the thick forests of that region. And here's the next look. Oh, hey, there's a village that is put there. Notice the villagers to put that home there had to clear out some of the plants, right? Well, those plants grew really fast, so the villagers would make sure that was all clear. So instead of the Europeans having to come in and cut down all this forest to plant the rubber trees and to make rubber plantations, it was much easier for them just to burn down this area because this land was always already clear, and then they could plant the rubber trees there. And that's what this slide, I think, is going to show here. Burning it down, and then boom, they're putting in the rubber trees. And that's actually how they got rubber. I don't remember the exact percentage. I want to say like 30% of rubber today still comes from trees like this. They slice it, and it's like kind of oozes down and drops into these containers. Most rubber is synthetic, made in labs, but there still is rubber that you can get from rubber trees today. But sadly, they were destroying people's homes to make it easier to put these trees. And you can see then they could kind of plant them in a row and make it much easier to collect. And it was very dangerous for them as they went to go get this rubber. Again, if they didn't get enough, they could be killed. And one of the ways they tried to convince people in this region to work for them is probably the most famous and dastardly thing that came out of this. And I think we're going to see a picture here in a second. It's a little disturbing, just to warn you. And it said, King Leopold never saw a drop of blood spilt in anger. He never set foot in the Congo. So he never did. The king never went there. And yet destroyed so many people, and it's kind of like a modern day bomber pilot who can drop a bomb but never see what the bomb does to the people he drops it on. These pictures here are going to be uncovered. The one on the left is a political cartoon. The one on the right is a little disturbing, just to warn you. So the one on the left, people thought that King Leopold was trying to spread Christianity, but they started to get reports of the horrible things that were happening there. And so this is called In the Rubber Coils. It's from a British magazine showing that, Leopold was really like a rubber snake trying to kill the Africans and not help them. Sadly, here you see that these two people are missing their hands. What they would do is the Belgians would pay the Africans some of their soldiers that they would hire that were Africans and pay them by the number of people they killed. But to get credit for killing the people, they would have to chop off their right hand. And that's how they would get credit for it. You might say, well, couldn't you just chop off the right hand? Because they didn't want two hands from the same body to get two credits. So it was always had to be the right hand. And what they would do, there was someone actually called the Keeper of the Hands. I have some primary resources about this. We don't have time to read, sadly, but because we're not together. But they would actually smoke these hands so that they would dry out, so that they wouldn't start to decompose in those jungles. And it was extremely, extremely awful. And these are two kids I can't even imagine. Obviously, a lot of kids probably are people who had their hands cut off. Most of them were dead. So why would they cut off the hands of people if they weren't dead? Since they were trying to get credit for killing people, they shouldn't have ever been dead. But what some of the soldiers did is they wanted to save their bullets, because then they could use their bullets to hunt food, because the Belgians would only give them so many bullets and they would get in trouble if they wasted them. So what they'd do is they'd cut off a living person's hand, save the bullet, and save it for themselves. And that's what they would do. And so there were a lot of people like this, sadly, who actually had their hand cut off when they were alive. This is a crazy fact to me. So all this death and destruction, we said around 10 million people happened in the Belgian Congo, which is present-day Democratic Republic of the Congo. In Belgium, in terms of its size, is the Belgian Congo was 80 times bigger than, and I don't know if you can see it right here, that says Belgium. So I changed the font to show this is like 80 times bigger than this font. And just to show you the difference, like this little teeny country was able to control all of this because of their advantages that they had just recently gained from the Industrial Revolution. And so this picture is probably the worst one for me, one of the worst of the year. Again, here is a Belgian with some soldiers who, and I put boxes here just because you guys don't need to see it. It's just because they were real people's hands, and it just bothers me to even have to talk about it. But you need to know about it to know that these things have happened in history. They're holding up the hands of people that they killed. And then this is the worst picture for me of the year, just because as a father, it's so bothersome to me. He refused to go out and gather rubber. And so what they did is laying here in front of him is the hand and foot of his daughter. They actually severed it and put it before him and made him, and they said, hey, this is what you caused. And notice all these other people watching. That was a powerful signal to them, like, don't cross the Belgians. But just, when I see this picture and I think that Leopold II was saying, oh, I'm here to bring Christianity and end slavery in the Belgian Congo, that was obviously the biggest pack of lies you could ever hear. And it was just outrageous what was going on in the Belgian Congo. And it wasn't until later that people started to realize it. And eventually the Belgian people and the government said, enough of this, king. You can't have that anymore. And he basically lost it. But it was just devastating. Okay. So Africa did eventually gain its independence. After World War II, many of the countries started realizing that having these things was A, wrong, and B, too expensive. And then just the world started kind of being against it, and there were independence movements. And so when did they finally get their independence? Well, the 1950s and 60s. I would say the 1960s is what, if I had to pick one day to be 1960, is when they get independence. So if you think about it, that's what, 60 years ago. So only 60 years ago. So when my mom was and dad were in school, they learned all those countries were not the countries we know today. They were controlled by European powers. So that's only 60 years of freedom. And so what's so key about this? Can anyone think what might be why this is such a big deal that they've only had 60 years of freedom? Because Africa has only had around 50 or 60 years to overcome the problems caused by imperialism. Imperialism caused so many problems, they have not had much time to rebound from them. And if we think about Latin America, who we talked about, they had just been getting over a lot of their problems from when they were controlled by the Spanish, and that was 200 years ago. So to think that Africa all of a sudden is just going to, like, after all those damaging things were done to them, just automatically like gain all this power and wealth, it's not realistic. Now, there are some African nations who have done better, and there are some African nations who are not doing well. And I'm not saying it's 100% the fault of the European powers that went there, because certainly, there have been dictators in Africa, and there's been corruption in some part of Africa. But as Gandhi said to the British once, he said, yeah, we have problems, but at least they're our problems, not yours. And so just something to think about. We'll talk about more of that type of thing when we talk about Gandhi. So just real quick, this is Africa 1955. The only areas that were not controlled by Europe in 1955 are these orange color here. I don't know if it's more yellow for you. So there's these little areas here. But then look what it looks like in the 1960s and 70s. Almost all of it then becomes free. So it was a real quick turnaround there in the 60s and 70s. There were a couple areas that didn't get their freedom till later, but for the most part, they did. That's it. So I just wish I could tell you so much more about this, but I hope this just gives you a general picture. And when you think of kind of an example of the horrible things that happened, I'm hoping by your reading of your Newsella and by that little bit of information about the Belgian Congo, it gives you a little idea as to the horrible things that happened all throughout much of Africa during the time of imperialism. So I guess that's it. You can take the quiz that I'm going to be posting here soon on this, and it'll be like, around 8 questions again. Just a reminder, every single thing due is due the Sunday of that week. So theoretically, you would not have to have done anything so far this week until Sunday by 11:59. So I just want you to have the flexibility to do it whatever works best for you during that week, because I know some of you are watching again siblings, some of you are helping your families out, you have other classes, so I just want to give you that flexibility. But anyhow, thanks for joining me, and I'll see you again in one of these little note lessons here pretty soon. And thanks again. Talk to you soon. And hopefully this will help finish up everything you need to do for history. And then we're going to have a little spring break next week. So thanks again. Bye.